Hey, there we go. For a second there, my computer was not wanting to show you my face, which I guess wouldn't have been the worst thing in the world, but I like to imagine that I can see you all, so this is much better. How is everybody? Can you hear me? All right. Hi, Alex. Yay. Awesome. Careful Poet, how's it going? Hey, Nikki and Micah, hi. Oh, I'm glad you're all here. And Brian, this is great. I just get to say, sit here and say hello to everybody. And I love that so many of you are people that I have met in real life, like at conferences and at church things and at groups. I love that I know a bunch of you. That's awesome. It's good to see you all. I'm glad you're here. Oh, hi. Cool. We've got a new friend here too. Is it Sekti? I want to say it right. So tell me if I'm saying it wrong. Oh, Setki. I changed the T and the K around. So tell me if I'm still saying that wrong, and I will try to fix it. Glad to have you. Glad that you're here. Glad all the people are here. So here we are. Happy Wednesday night. It's Bible study time. I hope you're all doing well. Tonight we are talking about Proverbs Chapter 31. And we haven't really done any work in Proverbs in our Bible studies. And honestly, I don't know if I really talked about them in any of the Trans and Christian videos either. Proverbs are an interesting book full of proverbs, as one might expect. So we're going to talk a little bit about this one chapter and about gender. It's going to be fun. Hi, Barry. I'm glad you're here. Setki, that is great. I love that. That you're trying to teach yourself Vulcan. I didn't know that Vulcan was a thing that you could learn. Like I knew that you could learn what's Worf? Klingon. I knew you could learn Klingon, but I didn't know you could learn Vulcan. So that makes me really happy that that's even a possibility for people. Anyway, if you want us to call you something else, try to put it in the chat and I will do my best to remember. I usually have to read pretty fast, so I usually have to read people's names as they're coming in, but I'll try to remember if people need to change them. So hey, let's talk about Proverbs. I'm pumped about it. Proverbs, like I said, it's a book full of Proverbs. That's why it's got its name. It's part of the canon of wisdom literature in the Hebrew Bible. So if you've got sort of your Christian Bible that's got Old and New Testaments right next to each other, you usually have sort of Genesis through, I just forgot the last book of the Old Testament. Oh my gosh, I was going to say Genesis through Revelation, but that's the New Testament. Y'all, my brain is not on full blast tonight, so it's going to take me a little bit to warm up into this. Malachi. Thank you, Jolene, for getting that for me. I was just going through the song in my head. Genesis through Malachi is what you've got in the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, you, of course, have Matthew through Revelation. So that's what we've got if you're looking at your Christian Bible. And the books are kind of organized within a Christian Bible in sort of like a timeline type format, where it's kind of like, well, we think this book would have been written or happening around this time, so that's where we put it there. If you look at a Hebrew Bible or a Bible that you'd find in a Jewish synagogue or temple or JCC, wherever you're going to pick up a Hebrew Bible, they have them organized differently. They're organized into three chunks. You've got the Torah, which is the first 5 books, so Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And then you've got the prophets, which is all the prophets. So you've got your Nehemiah and your Ezra and your Isaiah and your Zechariah, and you've got all your prophets. They're the major prophets and the lesser prophets or the minor prophets. That's the second section. And then the last section is what's called the wisdom literature or the writings, either way. And the writings include, for instance, you've got your Psalms, you've got your Proverbs, you've got Ecclesiastes, and then you have some of the sort of stories like Esther and Jonah. Those are all go in the writings category. So that's kind of how we tend to think of the Bible, as like we sort of have like the first 5 books, which are the big deal, and then you've got all the prophets that are talking about what's going on with Israel as they interact with the laws in the first 5 books, and then you've got all the writings, which is sort of like a big catch-all. So Proverbs is one of those books. And the idea behind Proverbs is that it's the historical understanding of it is that they are things said by King Solomon, because Solomon was known as like the wisest king of Israel, right? So Proverbs have been attributed to Solomon in the way that like the first 5 books of the Bible have been attributed to Moses. Solomon probably did not write all of these proverbs, almost certainly, and we actually have some inscriptions that say like this is actually from this guy. So we know pretty much that they're not all written by Solomon, but that's been sort of the historical understanding. Zoe always forgets poor Malachi. Oh, who doesn't? So that's where we are in the Bible, looking at this wisdom literature, looking at Proverbs, and we're looking at Proverbs 31 because it's been a text that it's a text that talks about a woman who is seen in a very positive light. And this depiction of this woman has been used in different ways within Judaism and within Christianity to kind of understand what a good woman looks like. And so as we have been talking about gender throughout this whole Transit Christian video series, we haven't yet talked about this passage, which I thought was ridiculous when I came down and sat and like looked at all the passages we talked about. And then I was like, that's actually not so ridiculous because I'm a dude. And as a dude, I accidentally fall into sexism just as much as any other dude and tend to prioritize or look at things that have like more to do with masculinity because that's kind of where I am. And so I really wanted to lift this up as a text talking about femininity and how we understand femininity. And so tonight, the idea is I would really like to prioritize the folks that are sharing in chat who identify as femme or female or on the sort of femme end of a spectrum, anywhere in there. I would love to prioritize those voices because I can't speak about what it's like to be a woman. And so I would love to bring that forward if folks want to share as we talk about what this text means and what it means for us. So that's the plan for tonight. So why don't we go ahead and get into our text? We're going to be looking at Proverbs 31, and you'll maybe notice if you pull it up, and I want to get it in the translation that I want. I'm going to be reading the NRSV, as you know that I tend to do. So if you're reading other translations, there are definitely going to be some differences here because this text is a poem, which means that it's very open to interpretation in a lot of ways. And so if you're reading in another translation, I would love to know if there are like specific things that jump out as like really different to you between what I'm reading and what you're reading. So that's always fun to put in the chat. Let's see. So Proverbs 31 is what we're looking at. And verses 1 through 9, this is sort of split into 2 bits, this chapter. Verses 1 through 9 are a separate bit from the second part of the chapter. So we're going to actually be looking, both of these 2 sections talk about what a good woman looks like. But we're going to kind of put that first bit aside, and we're going to focus specifically on verses 10 through 31. So that's a lot of verses, but they're real short, so it won't take us that long to read it. So 10 through 31, Proverbs 31, verses 10 through 31. And I'm going to put that in the chat too, so that people can see it when they come in later. Proverbs 31, 10 through 31. Cool, so that's what we're reading. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, here we go. So again, I'm reading the NRSV version. A capable wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from far away. She rises while it is still night and provides food for her household and tasks for her servant girls. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands, she plants a vineyard. She girds herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid for her household when it snows, for all her household are clothed in crimson. She makes herself coverings. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the city gates, taking his seat among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them. She supplies the merchant with sashes. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her happy. Her husband too, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her a share in the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the city gates. So that's a lot, right? All right. Oh, good. Alex is putting in differences as we're going here. And Alex is reading the New King James Version. Yeah, so you've got a couple of differences there. Yes, I like it. Beauty is passing instead of vain. Yep. Yeah, so we've got a couple of differences there. Not too much in meaning, but just sort of like different ways of saying the same thing, which is really common in Hebrew verses because in Hebrew, it's a relatively small vocabulary for a language. And so every word has to mean multiple things because they don't have that many synonyms. So one word can mean, like the word, for instance, that my verse translates as jewels, Alex's version translated as rubies, right? So for some reason, the King James folks were like, not just jewels, but rubies. And the other folks with the NRSV were like, well, it could just be jewels in general, right? They have to guess because there aren't that many synonyms. There probably wasn't a specific word for rubies versus jewels. So that's why, we get a lot of different meanings because we have, sorry, I totally got distracted by the chat. We have a lot of different meanings because there aren't that many synonyms. Got distracted by Conrad's message, which says, is it weird that this passage kind of triggers me? No, I don't think it is. And that's because I say that because this passage has, we got a couple things to say about this. One, this passage has been used to tell women that they're not good enough and to tell people who are not women, but who are assigned female that they're not good enough. And there's just like a lot of weird expectations around this. And there might also be, it's also coming from a somewhat, from like a patriarchal background, right? Where it's like, well, this is what women are supposed to do and they better do it or else. Like that can feel really weird. So it's not weird that you feel weird. Yeah, so let's talk about this. So the first thing that I want us to notice about translation is that the word for the beginning, the word, like for instance in verse 10 where it says a capable wife who can find, right there you're going to have a whole bunch of different translations of what that first sentence in the first verse is, because the word that's used there, that's translated in my version as wife, is just a general word that could mean woman or it could mean wife. And so sometimes people read it, and also the my version that says capable, there's like a bajillion other ways that that's been translated as well. So we're going to talk about that in a second. But I want to say specifically about the woman thing, that it could mean just woman in general, or it could mean wife. It's weird because there is a different specific word to use for wife, but it's not, they don't use that word. They use the general word. And so when you're reading this, people have used that to kind of say, well, this applies to all women. It should be a good woman or an excellent woman, right? They mean it in sort of a larger way, and they take it and they sort of implement it in that sense of all women should be like this. But when you read the actual context of the verse, you notice that it talks about her husband and her children. And so that's why a lot of translations will switch it and turn it and say, it's not just woman in general. It actually does mean wife. The other reason that people think that it means wife specifically is because this previous section that we didn't read, verses 1 through 9, are talking about what kind of person you should marry. And so they kind of go, you know what, this is really specifically talking about a wife and not a woman in general. So that's just a little bit of background on the language of who this woman is. Let's see. Yeah. So, oh, good. I'm so glad Anita brought this up. Anita, you're so ahead of us. Anita says, what is the purpose of the first line being a question? Yes, okay. So the first line, you'll notice, is formulated like a question where it says, and this is in basically every version, we put a question mark in there. Now, there's no punctuation in Hebrew. So the Hebrew does not have a question mark, but what they do is they have words that basically act like question marks. So one of the words that is used is ma or me. There's a way to sort of explain that this is a question that's happening, even though there's no punctuation. So we know that this first line is a question. A capable wife who can find, or who can find a virtuous woman? It's a question because this is not describing a specific woman. And more than that, there's kind of the sense that this woman isn't possible. This idea of like, who can find a woman like this? Nobody. There's a sense of like, we're describing this woman who isn't real. She gives sort of an idea of like what is good versus what is bad, but this perfect woman doesn't exist. And so that sense of beginning with who can find such a woman is very much to give like, this is great, but like, well, that's life, you know? So that's why we've got this first line being the question. Micah says, what is the background and who is this written to? Do we know the intended audience? Yes. So that's another great question here to help us frame this. The intended audience, the hearers of Proverbs in general, was men. And the hearers of this particular chapter is also men. Going back to the beginning of the chapter, which we didn't read, you'll see verse 1 is this subscription, which says, the words of King Lemuel, an oracle that his mother taught him. And so then we've got verses 2 through 9 that talk like sort of about how to find a wife. And then the second bit is like this big description of the wife. And there's kind of disagreement about whether or not these two pieces are supposed to be connected or not. But regardless, this is basically, it was addressed to men about how to find a woman or a wife, or about what to encourage in the wives that they already have. So it's interesting because what you've got here is, especially with that superscription that says an oracle that his mother taught him. Oracle in this sense is not like somebody who tells the future. This just is like a saying that his mother taught him. So basically what you've got here is a chapter that's describing women to men so that men can pick good women, which is kind of convoluted and weird. But when you think about the fact that the audience for this would be men, then it comes a little clearer the fact that this was not supposed to be something that was like read to women in order to like shame them and get them to act more like this. This was more of a description of the kind of person that you would already hope to find in the world. Does that make sense? So like, this wasn't something that people were reading to their daughters to be like, this is what you got to do. That's not how this was meant. And in fact, the way that this text is actually used today in Jewish contexts is there is, some people sing it, some people just recite it, but there's a song that men and children sing to wives as part of the home Shabbat service on Friday nights that includes this text. And they sing it to the wife to praise her, not to be like, you got to do this, but to essentially fulfill those last verses of Proverbs where it says, way down in Verse 28, her children rise up and call her happy, her husband too, and praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. So the idea is that in the Friday night services, if you are a Jewish person who practices at home, if you are the woman or the mother in the home, you have this recited to you to basically tell you how great you are, which is adorable, and I love it. So that's the way that it's used within Judaism, right? Now, the way that it's used within Christianity is much more like, here's what you got to live up to, girls, which can be a lot more difficult. But like I said, that wasn't what the original sort of narrative of this text was for. Yeah, it's Careful Poet says evangelicals made something cute into something very shaming. Yeah, that's a little bit what's going on here. So like I said, this is not a job description. And so that's, I think, how we have accidentally messed with this within Christian circles. So I want to read you all something while we're talking about this before we move on to my next, I got a bunch of questions to ask you all. But before we move on to that, I want to read you something from my friend Rachel Held Evans. She wrote a lot about this text and talked a lot about this text. It was something that was really important to her as somebody who grew up within an evangelical Christian context that taught this like it was a job description. And she wrote about it in her book, A Year of Biblical Womanhood, which is a wonderful book. And if you haven't read it, you should check it out. She essentially tries to follow all the biblical commands for women to see if it works out, and it's quite good. So you should check it out if you haven't. But she wrote specifically about this passage, and so I thought I would just read that really quickly because this is just such a cute idea. This idea of having somebody read this to you. So I'm going to read here, and now I didn't bring my hard copy. I've got my online copy, so I can't tell you what page this is, but it's her chapter on Proverbs 31, so you'll be able to find it. So Rachel says, and now I should tell you before we go into this, that the Hebrew for that first line, a virtuous woman who can find, or a capable wife who can find, those words there, the virtuous woman or capable wife, the Hebrew is eshet hayil. And eshet hayil is a sort of this idea, right? This idea of the virtuous woman or the good woman. And so eshet hayil is what Rachel is really kind of honing in on here when she talks about this text. What does that actually mean? So Rachel says, eshet hayil is at its core a blessing, one that was never meant to be earned, but to be given unconditionally. Hold on, I got to read this bit. Okay, I had to skip over a bit. It's like their version of "You Go Girl," I explained to Dan, her husband, at the dinner table that night, glowing from the nerdy high of learning a foreign-sounding phrase. How do you say it again, he asked. Eshet hayil, I responded with my stubborn southern accent and all the confidence of someone who has no idea what she's talking about. You say the H from the back of your throat. Yeah, I'm not going to remember that, Dan said. What does it mean exactly? It means woman of valor. Well, that's what you are to me, Dan said. You're a woman of valor. My heart swelled in my chest, as it would again and again in the months to come, as Dan found ways to invoke the new blessing in the midst of our daily routines. When my blog sold enough ads to become profitable, he looked up from the computer, smiled, and declared, "Woman of valor." When I finally got around to cleaning out the guest room closet, he high-fived me and shouted, "Woman of valor." When I stumbled through the front door after a long day with nothing but takeout pizza to show for dinner, he stretched out his arms in absolute delight and cried, "Pizza, woman of valor." It's amazing what a little poetry can do for a marriage. So Rachel talks about how this works with her friends, and she says, I saw how powerful and affirming this ancient blessing, eshet hayil, could be. I decided it was time for Christian women to take back Proverbs 31. Somewhere along the way, we surrendered it to the same people who invented airbrushing and auto-tune and Rachel Ray. We abandoned the meaning of the poem by focusing on the specifics, and it became just another impossible standard by which to measure our failures. We turned an anthem into an assignment, a poem into a job description. But the woman described in Proverbs 31 is not some ideal that exists out there. She is present in each one of us when we do even the smallest things with valor. So it's great. It's a great book. And Rachel's take on Proverbs 31 is one of my favorites. The idea that like everything can be done with valor, and that it's not a job description, it's a blessing. So yeah, you should definitely check that out if you can. And so that's kind of where we are with this text, that we've got this beautiful blessing text that is not supposed to be a job description. So now that we've sort of like made that clear so that nobody has to feel bad about like not being these things or doing these things, some of which wouldn't make sense for us to do anyway. Now I actually want to get into what's in this text. What is this talking about? Who is this woman and what is she doing? And how do we understand femininity in this context? So let's take a look at Proverbs 31. As you're looking at it, let's talk about physical attributes in this text. Hi Lachlan, we're looking at Proverbs Chapter 31, verses 10 through 31. So as we're looking at these verses, where do you see examples of physical descriptions of this woman? What does this woman look like? And that can be like body-wise or clothing-wise. Where do you see physical descriptions of this woman? How does this woman look? What does her gender expression look like? That's the first question I've got for you. Alex says she has strong arms. Agreed. That's verse 17. She girds herself with strength and makes her arms strong, specifically her arms. I love it. Careful Poet says dresses herself with strength. Yep. Conrad says strength is hot. All right. Let's not objectify the woman of Proverbs 31. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Yep. And there's something about, so where it says fine linen and purple, that idea is like, these are rich cloths, right? This is not your everyday clothing. This is nice stuff. Eaton says she has wisdom. Yep. So that might be something that you can kind of see. Micah says royalty. Yeah. Conrad says royal. Yep. This idea that she has some sort of like royal bearing, right? And that might be like something that is specific to her. It might have something to do with this idea that this might be part of like this kingly descriptor that's going on here. Strength and dignity is her clothing. So yes, so let's look. I want to just double check here to see if there's anything else that we missed that I wanted to talk about. But I think you got most of it. We've got clothing. We've got strong arms. Yeah. So I think those are the kind of the main ones that we've got in terms of what gender expression that we've got going on here. Jolene says she smiles at the future. Yeah, I love that. The Hebrew there, again, you could translate it a lot of different ways. She laughs at the future is another way that's translated, which I really like. So yeah, so we've got a woman basically who, if you're looking at her, she's got very royal bearing. She's wearing very royal clothes. She's very strong. So this is kind of the image of the woman that we have here, right? What she actually looks like. So let's get into the things that she does now. So can we pick out some, we're going to go real binary with this right now, just to kind of like understand what's going on here. What things is she doing that you read as more masculine? Because Brian, for instance, says she does traditionally masculine things by providing for her household. So what traditionally masculine things do you see this woman doing? Alex says she provides food for the family. Careful Poet points out she wakes up early to work, so she's doing work, and it's not just work in the house, right? She's working outside of the house. What other things is she doing? She engages in commerce and buys a field, says Anita. Exactly. So she's not sitting around waiting for her husband to buy a field. She's in charge of the money, which is cool. She plants a vineyard, right? So a lot of times when we read about, so women in this ancient Hebrew context might go out to tend the vineyard, but it was kind of unusual for a woman to plant, to just go out and start hauling trees around. Yep, Jolene says she buys property. Let's see. I've got in verse 18, it says she perceives that her merchandise is profitable. This idea of the woman as the small business owner, which I love. Yeah, Anita says she manages the servants. Yep. Now that one is interesting because throughout history, the person in charge of the servants has kind of changed genders several times depending on where you are in the world and what time period you're in. But that's an interesting note. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I think you got all the ones that I was looking at. Yeah. So we've got all these things that she's doing that seem to be more stereotypically masculine within this context, right? One thing, Alex says she watches over the way of her household. Interesting how people say only men are the head of the household. Yeah. So we've got this woman that is clearly in charge, she is in charge in many, many ways. So one thing that I think is super interesting that I wanted to bring forward is a comment that I read from Dr. Will Gaffney, who is a womanist scholar. And she wrote just a short thing on Proverbs 31. She's probably written about it elsewhere too. But the bit that I read that jumped out to me is that there's something going on here with the translation because there are warrior words and war words in this text that we've decided to translate in a softer way in English. So, for instance, you've got... wait, where did it go? I just lost my thing. Hold on. This is what happens when you have too many tabs open. Wait for it. Okay, cool. Here we go. Found it. So in verse 15, for instance, where it says she provides food for her family. So she rises while it is night. She provides food for her household. The word for food there is one that's usually used for prey if somebody is out hunting. So this idea that this word that is not just a general food word, but actually means something that you've hunted and killed, that word is what's going on here. She's brought home food, but it's food that's been sort of it's prey, it's been hunted. So another example, I'm just going to pull all these examples here because I just think they're really fascinating. Another example, verse 11. In verse 11, where it says, the heart of the husband trusts in her and he will have no lack of gain, is the way the NRSV translates it. The word for gain there is the word that's used for spoils of war. So you've kind of got this vision of this woman who is going out and bringing home stuff, but it's stuff that she's conquered and sort of won. So there's this just because we've translated it in kind of the way that makes sense if you're thinking about this woman as somebody who works in the home, but you could just as easily translate it as this woman went out and kicks ass and brings stuff home. And that's how the family is eating, right? Hang on, let me pick out one more because there's a whole bunch of these where it's well, why did we translate it that way? Wait for it. Oh yeah, so the word for she watches, so verse 27. So I want to pull up verse 27 in my version. where it says, verse 27, my version says, she looks well to the ways of her household. That version, to look well, the way that it's translated there, is a phrase that can be translated as spies. Like within a military context, you send people to go watch over something, and it's meant as this idea of like the military person checking out to make sure everything is okay. And so there's all of these weird translation things where we've got a word that could be multiple things, but the way that it's most often used in the Bible, because the Bible's written from a very male context, it's most often like if the woman in this chapter was a man, this would all have been written in military language. But because it's a woman, we translated it in a way that made it seem what we thought was more feminine. So it's just translators and people who are studying this passage today, they think that the idea here was that essentially the writers wanted a proverb for women that would kind of come up against the depictions of men as warriors, something that was kind of like, well, if you've got all these depictions of like men as like mighty warriors, then let's also have a depiction of what a woman looks like, but we want it to be kind of similar. Like we want a strong woman parallel to the strong man thing. So there's a whole bunch that you could say that's messy about that and the requirement of a binary. But this idea that this woman is a kick-ass hero is pretty legit in terms of what's going on with the translation. Anita says, what is the woman's role in verse 23 with her husband sitting at the city gates? Yeah, so verse 23, her husband is known in the city gates, taking his seat among the elders of the land. So the city gates were where people would settle disputes, and like the people that were in charge of the community would sit at the city gates. So the idea here is she's got a real good husband. Like she knows how to pick them is kind of the idea here. She's got a husband who's high up in the community. And so again, remembering that this passage would have been read to men, I think that was kind of a moment of like, hey, if you want a woman like this, you better man up and be a man who can sit at the city gates and be on the elders' council, right? So I kind of think that's what's going on there. But yeah, no, that's the idea, is that she's got a good husband and she knows what she's doing. Does it say something about her facilitating her husband's success? Interesting. I don't know. Within the context of this passage, a man could still be profitable even if his woman was not this awesome. Even if his wife was not this awesome, a man could still be profitable. So it's like, it's frustrating because I want to say, of course, without her, he wouldn't be able to be who he is. But within a context that values men way more than women, here, it might still have been possible. So it's kind of hard to say. Eaton. So when I said man up, I mean, like, I think what was going on with that bit about her husband being a important guy in town is that it was trying to get the men who are reading this text to think, well, if I want a woman who is this cool, then I have to be a man who's really important. So it was kind of supposed to be a sort of a good example for men when they were reading it at the time. Jolene points out something which I love. The Proverbs 31 woman being strong does not emasculate her husband. The fact that she's doing all this stuff does not make her husband feel bad or not good enough. Like, he's still doing his thing in the city gates, but like, she's taking care of everything, right? And that doesn't make him feel like any less of a man, that she's basically provider. Like, she's basically the provider for the family and does all this stuff, which is cool. Micah says, I'm wondering possibly if it might also be a way to say to men who are already in those positions of power that they should also look for a wife who is strong. Right. So I think there could be something to that. The idea that, like, well, if you are going to be a powerful man in this community, your wife better measure up, which I kind of hate to think about, the idea of like it's still a thing today, right? Like if you are, okay, so here's a great example, right? If you're a male pastor who is married to a woman, there are all these expectations about what the pastor's wife is supposed to do, because like the pastor's supposed to look good, so the pastor's wife is supposed to make him look good, right? So there's like that whole complicated stuff going on. But we do have to remember that, like, we just have to remember this is not a prescription. This is not a list of requirements, right? This is these are good things to work toward in life, but they're not a list of things that you have to check off in order to be a good person. Because, like the beginning of this whole passage says, who can find such a person? Nobody is this good. Yeah. Okay. See, I misread Micah. So Micah says a way to say to not measure up. I was meaning it more in the sense of don't view yourself as more than her. I know it's hard to write in 200 characters. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah, the idea that, like, if we've got, because nothing in this text, nothing in this whole Proverbs 31 text says anything about like who is, like, there's how do I want to say this? There's none of the sort of like, well, look at this awesome woman, but we know that men are better anyways at the end. Like there could have been something like that, and there isn't. This idea of like, yeah, there's yeah, like what Anita said, is it a statement that the wife will be a full partner in the success of the family? That this idea that, like, both of these people in the family are doing their thing, and neither one of them appears to be better than the other one within this context. And I think that's something that, you read this text and we're focusing on what the woman is doing, right? So you could very easily read this text and be like, the woman's doing all the work, and like, what is the guy even doing, right? But I think that's the whole point, is that we never get to see what the women are doing. So like being able to swing over here to be like, let's focus on this for a minute is good. But yeah, it's sort of it's an attempt to equalize the power, maybe. I like that. Let's see. So hang on, I got way off of my list of questions to ask us. So we've talked about what gender expression looks like. We've talked about like physical traits. We've talked about actions that you might see as more stereotypically masculine or feminine. Let's talk about differences sort of then and now. What pieces of this text do you see that are still like relevant things that people want? Like, what are the differences between this view of women and the view of women that you might see in other Christian spaces? Like, what are differences? Like, for instance, when I read this text, I see a woman who is not only a wife and a mother, but is also a business owner and like travels, and like she does things outside the home as well, right? And I see that as a difference, because within I think within a lot of Christian circles, there's still a little bit more emphasis placed on like, you should be a mom and you should stay home versus like, go out and do your business thing. And this woman is doing both. And from what I have heard from the women in my life, doing both is really, really hard. So like acknowledging that. But to me, I see a difference between the expectation. What are the differences in expectations between then and now? Are there different expectations now than there were then? Does that make sense as a question? Careful Poet says, I feel like people would be angry with this woman in conservative evangelical spaces. She's not quiet or passive. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's a big thing that I like. Yeah, so Conrad says Proverbs 31 in Christian spaces is about putting women in their places, so to speak. Yeah, I think that's why this is so confusing, right? Because this text has been used to be like, here's what you should do, women. You should be a good wife, and you should make clothes, and you should stay home with the kids. But that's literally like a a third at most of this text. So how are we like ignoring the whole rest of the text? Like, what's going on there? Are there things that anybody wants to say about the experience? Because I mean, this is a long list, right? That you've got. She works with her hands. She brings food. She manages the household. She buys and plants in the field. She sells merchandise. She spins and weaves. She makes clothes. She what else does she do? She talks with people and advises them. She does a lot of stuff, right? And the idea here is that one person even do all this stuff, right? That's again that question of like, this person is too perfect to exist. But is there anything that anybody wants to say about being a working mom who looks at this and like, what is your experience of this? If you are a working mom or a working parent who identifies as femme, is this a text that looks at all like familiar to you? Is this something that looks at all like, is this totally beyond the pale of the possible? What does this look like for you? I'm gonna read the text while you tell me. Okay. Sorry, I just had to take a minute to read through all the chat because I missed a bunch of messages. Jolene says, speaking to what you mentioned about working moms, this proverb kind of fits into the pressure to do it all easily. We should be able to do everything easily without stress or difficulty. Yeah. So that I think you really hit the nail on the head there about how a lot of women, even if they see the more empowering parts of this text, it can still look like a laundry list, right? It can still look like, oh my gosh, I have to do all this stuff and like laugh at the future at the same time. Like, how am I going to do all this? And I think that's a totally legitimate criticism. And it's why, Rachel and so many other women came to the conclusion about like, this is not a checklist. This is not something like you don't have to do all of these things. This woman is too perfect. And if we compare ourselves to somebody who is just inhuman, then that makes us feel bad, right? So we can't use it like a measuring stick, but I think that's a way that it has definitely been used. Yeah. Ooh, Alex says, I don't necessarily think it means that she didn't have stress. It's just focusing on praising her for all she does because she worked really hard. Yeah. So, and then Alex also says, also it could have been easier because she had servants, similar to someone having a nanny or maids to help. Yeah. So let's take those two things separately. The first thing, I think you're absolutely right, Alex, in that the idea here is not that it's a laundry list, but that it's praising her for what she is already doing. And it's calling on the other people in a family to praise like, if there's a woman in your family who's like a woman of valor, to praise her, right? They're not praising her for getting everything done. They're praising her for who she is. And like, there's more to it than that. So I think you're maybe on the right track there. The other thing that you said about the servants is something that I think it's really important to recognize. So, there are different ways that we might understand this. One way is in the sort of Downton Abbey way of having help, in which case it's important to remember that, there might be people who are like helping her, and that's part of why she can get all this stuff done, and the things that they do might be sort of ascribed to her. So that might be one way. The other thing, though, is like remembering, this is not so much the case for this text specifically, but it's the case for a lot of texts that we read, I think, in I think a lot of texts that we read in general sort of ascribe all of these successes to people who have had a lot of help making those things happen. So like when we read about, famous writers in the 1800s who did nothing but lay outside all day and write, it was because they had help making that possible so that they didn't have to make all their own food and all this other stuff, right? So yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge the people that may not have been mentioned that allowed this stuff to happen. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Conrad says, I just want to say this about this. The whole thing makes me think about my mom and how hard she worked. She's been a single mom most of her life. Legit. And I think that's the whole point of this passage, is to be like, hey, the women in your life are doing a lot of stuff. Pay attention. Thank them for it. Yeah. Setki says, I honestly identify with this passage in a lot of ways. My wife is a very strong woman who brings in more income than I do and pretty much takes charge of our household. Yeah, thank the women in your lives. Yeah, Careful Poet says, I wonder if we could use this like women who are any of these things are awesome, and including but not limited to. So if your wife is doing any of these things, great. Yes, agreed. Jolene, this is great. Oh, this is great. She reaches out and gets help. This idea where it says that she's got like servants in her household, right? So I think this is a hard thing to extrapolate because 99% of us don't have people like, working in our house. But the idea of reaching out to other people to ask for help, I think, is a great way to make this actually connect. Like, if the Proverbs 31 woman couldn't do all this stuff without help, then you're not expected to do all this stuff without help. Reach out and get help. Yeah. Okay, cool. I just had to get through the chat. I love that you're all so active tonight. This is great. So, okay, here's the last big question that I want to ask about this text. We just talked a lot about gender and women's roles and who this woman is. Where is God in this text? What does this text have to say about faith? That's my big question here. Where do you see, this is one of the things that is common in wisdom literature is sometimes God doesn't show up very much. So where do you see God in this passage? Eaton, I'm glad I made you think of your mom. Careful Poet says, do all to the glory of God, a call to the New Testament. Okay, so if we're reading forward, right, the idea of everything you do it for God's glory. Okay. Do you see that specifically in this text? Where do you see that specifically here called out? Jolene says, a woman who fears the Lord. Yep. Okay. So that's verse 30. So verse 30 is the only place where God is mentioned. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. What do we think that means? Okay, so I've got some conflicting stuff going on in the chat, which is good. Not necessarily conflicting, but like coming at things from different angles. So Conrad says, I think the freedom here comes from God. So the idea that maybe she fears the Lord and therefore she can do all these things. So that's kind of one way of going in. Anne goes the other way and says, maybe all these things are a sign of God's favor. So you kind of got that going on. We have to be careful there. We don't run into prosperity gospel by accident. Um, Careful, it says she knows that her strength and her wisdom and her value is in God, not in her looks or her charm. I like that. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about the fact that we've got those two things transposed on each other. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. So there's something here that's like the outward beauty and the sort of way that she works in the world can be more ephemeral, but she's grounded in something, right? So it's like the ephemeral versus the grounding in something important. Bye, Alex. It's nice to see you. Yeah, okay, so Micah, hold on, I will have to go back. I have to scroll back. Jolene says, also the Imago Dei. And then Micah says, I definitely see the Imago Dei theme. Yeah, so the idea here that like she, a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Yeah, the idea that there's like God, she's doing all of these like creative and creating things, and it's connecting to the idea of God. I can definitely see that. Oh, Careful Bullet, it was good to have you here. Thanks for being here. Anita says her motivation comes from her relationship with God. Ooh, Micah says, I see the Imago Dei and the authority she wields. Oh, I like that. I like the idea that you have this woman that is, yeah, actually, now that you say that, okay, that's clicking for me now in a way that it didn't before. This idea that like she is doing all these things and they're all, I don't know, there's something that's connecting for me about all these like creative acts that she works with her hands, she brings food, she plants trees, right? Like all of these things like are creative actions, and I can definitely see that idea of like authority in terms of like she directs people and her family and the servants and the household and the ground. Like she's doing all these sort of like directing and creating things, and I can definitely see that there for sure. That's really cool. Thank you for expounding on that, because I was like trying to connect the dots and it wasn't quite connecting, but I really like that. That's great. Yeah, Imago Dei, going back to God giving humanity dominion over the earth and the responsibility to care for it. Yeah, I love that. So yeah, I think a lot of you are hitting the nail on the head. This idea that she is grounded in her identity. She's grounded in her relationship with God, and things are sort of like proceeding out of that grounding. Yeah, and that I think, to me, that just is very realistic. The idea that you've got this person who is grounded in who she is and what she's about and her relationship with God, and then things sort of proceed out of that. And she doesn't, it's kind of weird. We didn't even talk about this, but she doesn't speak in this whole thing, right? She's described and her family speaks to her, but she doesn't necessarily speak. Although it says she opens her mouth with wisdom and the teachings of kindness is on her tongue. So that's describing her speaking. So she clearly does speak, but we don't actually get like a quote from her in this passage. And so it's not like she's ascribing. It's not like the Psalms where she would be like ascribing like or praising God for all of these things. She's the one being praised, which in a way, if you think about it, does kind of lead back to that Imago Dei thing. So yeah, it's an interesting way to think about it. Yeah. Yeah, Anne says virtue lists are also used later in the New Testament by Paul. Yeah, so there's not really a Hebrew equivalent of a virtue list like you would see in the Greek texts. But that's kind of the idea here, is like, these are things to strive for, but it's not something that you check off. Like, Again, I just want to be really clear about that. These are not things you have to check off in order to be womanly enough. Yeah. So yeah, I that's about all I have for all of you tonight, but this was a fun conversation, and thank you to all the folks who spoke up and shared your experiences, and especially for the femme folks who talked about their connections with this passage and what they think about it. This has been really fun. This is a really interesting text, and there's like so much more about it that we didn't even get into. So you can always learn more about the Proverbs 31 woman. Again, I'd highly recommend Rachel Held Evans' book, Year of Biblical Womanhood, if you're interested in this stuff, because she does a lot of really good text study on these passages. So I think that's all I got for you tonight. This has been really fun. Thanks for being here. Announcements before we go. As you all know, probably at this point, these videos are brought to you by the supporters over at the Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/Austin Lionheart, you'll be able to find my stuff. I have a lot of cool perks and stuff there, and community stuff. So if you want to get involved and you want to support these videos, you can do that over on the Patreon. Next week, we'll have our Trans and Christian support group, as we do on every other Wednesday. And that'll be same time as this next Wednesday. If you want to get involved with the support group, you can go to bit.ly/transchristiansupport. And then we'll see you back here in 2 weeks for another Bible study. So that's the plan. We're doing this time slot now, all evenings, all the time, because it's easier for folks. So that's the plan. So we'll see you next time. Thank you for being here, everybody. Bye to everybody in the chat.